From time to time, people have asked me about the process that goes into writing a sermon. Some weeks, the first thing one does is to look at the parashah to see what may be of interest or what could be a jumping off point for an interesting topic. At other times, one has a notion in advance and looks to see if there is some kind of a hook in the parashah that may relate to the topic that one wishes to discuss. And I must admit that there are times when it is a bit of a stretch, and there are times when it isn't possible to make a connection at all. Rarely has the task of finding a connection between what I wanted to address and the parashah been as easy and as obvious as it is today. In light of tomorrow's rally here in Washington, D.C., I knew that I wanted to speak this morning about not just the surge in anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and the importance of speaking up about it, but also about our response to it. And lo and behold, this week's Torah portion addresses that very topic, what we might call, to use a technical rabbinical term, it's a layup. The Torah readings in the past few weeks have dealt with the distribution of the land of Israel after the tribes are to enter the land. We read this week that the tribes, as Rabbi Weinblatt mentioned, of Reuven and Gad, tell Moshe that when the other tribes cross the Jordan River and go and enter into the promised land, they want to stay behind. They want to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Out of concern for their material well-being, they say that they want to live there because it is a region, quote, suitable for their cattle. They would like to, quote, build there sheepfolds for our flocks and towns for our children on the eastern side of the Jordan, not in the land of Israel. Moses is appalled by the request, and he responds forcefully. Unlike the request of the daughters of Tzlofchad, which we read about previously, he doesn't need to consult God or any outside sources to know the answer to their request. He knows exactly how he feels about it, and immediately says to them, "Will your brothers go to war and you will stay settled here?" In other words, how dare you make such an inappropriate request? Moses is disturbed by a number of things, including the fact that they place concern for their cattle prior to their concern for their children. But the primary offense they commit, in his eyes, is that they're committing the cardinal sin of separating themselves from the rest of the people of Israel, that they appear to be indifferent to the fate of their fellow Jews and their fellow Israelites. If there's anything we've learned in the last few weeks during the most recent war between Israel and Hamas, it is that, unlike Vegas, what happens in Israel doesn't stay in Israel. Last month's conflict between Israel and Hamas unleashed a torrent of attacks on Jews around the world, as well as on Jewish institutions and places of business associated with Jews. A kosher pizza restaurant on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a place where my grandchildren like to go for a snack after school, had a brick hurled through its window, as did the Jewish-owned hardware store next door. By now, many of us have seen and heard about the terrifying rampage of keffiyeh-wearing ruffians who attacked patrons in a Los Angeles sushi restaurant as they asked who among them was Jewish. A Chabad rabbi in Boston was stabbed multiple times just last week. Similar violent attacks on Jews are taking place throughout, not just here in America, but in Europe and around the world, as anti-Semites seem emboldened in their brazenness and lack of fear of repercussions for blatant attacks on Jews. And in addition to these physical attacks, social media has become a platform for amplifying and multiplying hateful, vicious invective against Jews and Israel. People who express support for Israel are bullied, intimidated, and silenced, all because Israel had the chutzpah to defend itself against the 4,300 rockets hurled at it from Gaza. That Israel was acting in self-defense and chose to act in a way that sought to minimize loss of life on both sides, and that it worked with precision to destroy Hamas targets while striving to avoid civil casualties, was irrelevant to these haters of Israel. Synagogues throughout the country and throughout the world have been targets of anti-Semitic acts of desecration, necessitating increased security in light of all the threats and vandalism. All of this reveals and exposes the falsity of the claim of those who say there is a difference somehow between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. The animosity towards Israel and Jews are intertwined and interchangeable, because for those who hate Israel, there's no distinction between the Jewish state and Jews. After all, when Russia attacks or invades Ukraine, it's not as if there are calls for violence or the need for increased security at Russian Orthodox churches here or elsewhere. Indeed, applying a double standard that subjects Israel to standards not applied to other nations is an attempt to camouflage and disguise blatant hostility towards Jews. Israel's late foreign minister, the brilliant Abba Eban, as long ago as 1975, in a column he wrote that appeared in the New York Times, explained that hatred of Israel and the Jewish people are one and the same, only on a slightly different scale. He wrote in 1975, quote, "There's no difference whatsoever between anti-Semitism and the denial of Israel's statehood. Classical anti-Semitism denies the equal right of Jews as citizens within society. Anti-Zionism denies the equal rights of the Jewish people, its lawful sovereignty within the community of nations. The common principle in the two cases is discrimination against the Jewish people. Indeed, there is no difference between the two. One bleeds into the other, and sometimes, unfortunately, literally, as revealed by the violence unleashed against Jews and Jewish institutions because of the war with Hamas. Trying to make a distinction between anti-Zionism, or hatred of Israel, and anti-Semitism, and claiming they're different, is kind of like trying to explain the difference between Lux and Nova. In his famous letter to the Jewish community of Rhode Island in 1790, the first president of the United States, George Washington, pledged that, quote, "The government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support." Well, just as Martin Luther King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 and said it is time to fulfill the pledge of equality guaranteed and granted to all its citizens, it is time for Washington's pledge to be fulfilled to the Jews of America as well. Now, unfortunately, although it is obvious that the time has come to take a strong stand against anti-Semitism in order to expose and unmask and reveal and expose hostility towards the Jewish state as little more than a seemingly acceptable and respectable form of this world's oldest hatred, there are those Jews and organizations claiming to speak for Jews who refuse to recognize it when it comes from certain quarters. They are somehow concerned that free speech not be stifled, or that criticisms of Israel might not be allowed, as if Israel lacks for critics. My answer to those Jews who refuse to stand up, those who refuse to join in condemning the enemies of Jews and Israel as one, is to refer back to our parashah, our Torah reading for this morning. Ultimately, Moshe allowed the tribes to settle outside the land of Israel, but they could do so only with a caveat. The proviso was they had to promise that if their fellow Israelites ever came under attack, they would come to their aid. Those living outside the land of Israel were not allowed to stand aside, to be indifferent to the plight of their fellow Jews. They were required by Moses to participate in defending the Holy Land and to stand with their fellow Jews. And so with that in mind, it's really not necessary to say any more. The connection between today's Torah portion and what it is that we need to do is obvious. Although we are on the other side of the river, in fact, we're on the other side of the ocean, we will and we must stand with our fellow Jews to join forces and together to fight the enemies of Israel, Jews, and the Jewish people. And let us say, Amen.